The night had settled gently over London, not with the harshness of storm or wind, but with a soft, enveloping hush, as though the city itself had grown weary and chosen to rest beneath a blanket of mist. From the windows of 221B Baker Street, the world appeared blurred and distant. Gas lamps glowed like faint stars, their halos diffused through the thickening fog. The occasional carriage passed, its wheels muffled against dampened cobblestones, fading almost as soon as it appeared. Inside, the fire crackled softly. I, John Watson, sat comfortably in my chair, a book resting half forgotten in my lap. The warmth of the room, combined with the steady rhythm of the flames, made it difficult to hold on to the sharper edges of thought. My eyelids grew heavy. Across from me, however, there was no such surrender. Sherlock Holmes stood near the window, tall and still, his silhouette outlined by the dim amber glow of the street beyond. In his hands rested his violin, though he did not play it, not yet. Instead, he gazed outward, as though the fog itself whispered secrets only he could hear. "You observe silence, Watson?" he said at last, his voice low, almost blending with the fire. I stirred slightly. "I observe only that London appears determined to sleep early tonight." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Ah, but silence is rarely empty. It is often occupied." Before I could inquire further, a sound reached us, subtle yet distinct, a knock at the door, not hurried, not desperate, but deliberate. Miss Hudson's footsteps followed, soft and measured, and moments later she appeared at the threshold, her expression tinged with polite concern. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Though I must say he seems rather unsettled." Holmes's eyes brightened, not with excitement, but with a quiet sharpening of attention. "Pray, show him in." The visitor entered with hesitation, as though uncertain whether he had arrived at refuge or judgment. He was a thin man, perhaps in his early 40s, though anxiety had etched deeper lines upon his face. His coat was damp from the fog, and his gloved hands trembled ever so slightly as he removed his hat. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice strained, "I trust I am not too late." Holmes gestured calmly toward the chair opposite mine. "You have arrived at precisely the moment required, I should think. Please, sit." The man obeyed, though he perched rather than rested, his posture taut with unease. "My name's Alistair Pembroke," he said. I am a collector of rare botanical specimens." Holmes inclined his head. "Yes, I gathered as much." The man blinked in surprise. "You did?" "Free furred forts a reef the scent of preserved foliage, and a small tear in your sleeve, consistent with thorned plants rather than urban hazards. You have come directly from your conservatory." Pembroke swallowed. "That is quite correct." The fire shifted, sending a soft cascade of sparks upward. "It must matters 40," Pembroke continued, "that brings me here tonight. Something has occurred, something I cannot explain." Holmes remained silent, inviting him onward. "There is a flower," Pembroke said slowly, "a black orchid. It is exceedingly rare, blooms once, perhaps twice in a lifetime. I have spent years acquiring it." His hands tightened together. "Tonight it bloomed." Holmes's gaze flickered, not with surprise, but with interest. "And," he prompted gently. Pembroke hesitated. "When I entered the conservatory to observe it, I found my colleague, Mr. Everley, lying beside it." "Dead?" I asked, sitting upright. Pembroke shook his head quickly. No, that is the strange part. He is not dead." Holmes stepped forward slightly, the firelight catching in his sharp features. "Then what precisely is his condition?" Pembroke's voice dropped to a whisper. "He is asleep." Holmes, a pause. A deep, unnatural sleep. He does not wake. He does not stir. And yet he breathes. The room seemed to grow quieter still. And there is more, Pembroke added, his eyes darting briefly toward the window, as though the fog might be listening. There were no signs of intrusion, no disturbance. The doors were locked from within. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. And the orchid? He asked. Pembroke's expression tightened. It emits a scent, he said, faint, almost imperceptible. But it lingers. Holmes tilted his head slightly. A scent, he repeated softly. Yes. Holmes turned toward the fire, his eyes distant for a moment, as though tracing invisible patterns in the air. Then quietly, how curious. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows, and somewhere, far off in the sleeping city, a clock began to toll the hour. The hour had deepened, though London itself seemed suspended in a peculiar stillness, as though time moved more softly beneath the weight of the fog. In the warm glow of 221B Baker Street, our visitor sat rigid, his unease pressing faintly against the calm of the room like a distant echo. Sherlock Holmes stood by the mantel now, one hand resting lightly upon it, the other raised to his chin. His eyes, half-lidded, held that far-away look I had come to recognize, not distraction, but intense inward focus. You say, Holmes began quietly, that Miss Everleigh lies in the state of sleep from which he cannot be roused. Yes, said Pembroke, his voice tight. We have tried everything. Calling his name, shaking him gently, even the application of cold water. There is no response, and a physician, I summoned one immediately. He found no injury, no fever, no sign of poisoning, only sleep. I shifted slightly in my chair. There are conditions, I offered, in which a patient may enter a prolonged unconscious state, though such cases are rarely so sudden. Holmes gave a faint nod, acknowledging the thought without turning. Had you discovered him beside the orchid? He asked. On the very floor of the conservatory, Pembroke replied, as though he had simply lain down. Holmes's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. As though, he repeated, or as if compelled? Pembroke hesitated. I cannot say. There followed a gentle silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock upon the mantel. At last, Holmes straightened. Watson, he said, your coat, if you please. I rose at once, setting aside my book. There was a quiet decisiveness in Holmes's tone that permitted no delay. We are going out? I asked. Immediately. Pembroke stood at the well, relief flickering across his features. You will come, then? Holmes reached for his coat and hat with unhurried precision. I'm dear Mr. Pembroke, he said. It would appear your orchid has bloomed at precisely the right moment. The streets received us with a cool embrace. The fog had thickened, though it did not press harshly. Rather, it drifted in slow currents, softening edges and swallowing distance. Gas lamps hovered like distant moons, their light dim and diffuse. Our carriage moved at a measured pace, its wheels hushed against the damp road. Inside, Pembroke spoke little. His gaze remained fixed upon the window, though there was little to see beyond shifting pale gray. Holmes, seated opposite him, had closed his eyes. To the casual observer, he might have appeared at rest, but I knew better. His stillness was not that of sleep. It was the stillness of calculation. You noticed it, did you not? Holmes said suddenly without opening his eyes. Pembroke blinked. Noticed? What, Mr. Holmes? The scent. Pembroke drew a slow breath. Yes, it is quite subtle. Holmes opened his eyes now, their clarity almost startling in the dim light. And yet, he said, you found it remarkable enough to mention before any other detail. Pembroke's lips parted slightly. as though he had not considered this. "I suppose I did." Holmes inclined his head faintly, curious. The carriage slowed. "We have arrived," Pembroke said quietly. The conservatory stood behind a large, elegant townhouse, its glass panes faintly aglow from within. Even through the fog, it possessed a peculiar presence, neither inviting nor foreboding, but watchful. As we approached, I became aware of the quiet. No wind stirred the nearby trees. No sound emerged from within the glass structure. It was as though the place existed apart from the rest of the world. Pembroke unlocked the door with trembling hands. "I must warn you," he said softly. "The scent may still linger." Holmes said nothing. We stepped inside. The air was warm, almost oppressively so, after the chill of the night. Moisture clung lightly to the skin, and the faint drip of condensation echoed softly from the curved glass above. Rows of plants stretched in ordered lines, their leaves glistening faintly under the lamplight, and there, at the center, a single dark bloom, the orchid. Its petals were of such deep shade that they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, not black in the crude sense, but a velvet darkness, rich and quiet. Even I, with little interest in botany, felt its presence, and beside it, a man lay upon the ground. John Watson stepped forward instinctively, that is to say, I did, kneeling at once to examine him. His breathing was slow, steady, his pulse regular, no injury, no visible distress. "Remarkable," I murmured. "He appears entirely at peace." Holmes did not approach immediately. Instead, he remained standing a short distance away, his gaze moving not to the man, but to the space around him, the floor, the arrangement of pots, the slight disturbance of a nearby leaf. "You attempted to wake him here?" Holmes asked. "Yes," Pembroke replied, but nothing availed. Holmes took a slow step closer, then another. At last, he stood beside the orchid. For a moment, he simply observed it. Then, very slightly, he leaned forward, not touching, not disturbing, only breathing. A pause. Holmes straightened again. "Well?" I asked, quietly. He turned his head just enough that I could see the faintest hint of something unusual in his expression. Not alarm, not confusion, but recognition. "It is as you said," Holmes murmured. "The scent is faint." Pembroke exhaled shakily. "Yes." Holmes's eyes drifted once more across the conservatory. "To most," he continued softly, "it would pass entirely unnoticed." He took a slow step back, but to those who pay attention, his voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "It is not the scent of a flower at all." The silence that followed seemed to deepen, as though the glass house itself had drawn a quiet breath. Outside, beyond the panes, the fog pressed gently closer, and within, the sleeping man did not stir. The stillness within the conservatory lingered long after Holmes had spoken. His words, quiet though they were, seemed to settle into the warm, humid air like fine dust, altering something invisible yet undeniable. I remained kneeling beside the unconscious man, my fingers resting lightly against his wrist. His pulse continued with steady precision, each beat calm, untroubled, as though he lay not upon cold stone, beneath an exotic bloom, but in the comfort of his own bed. "There is no distress," I said softly, "no indication of struggle or illness. It is as if sleep has simply claimed him." Behind me, Sherlock Holmes moved slowly through the conservatory, his steps measured, almost soundless against the tiled floor. "Sleep," Holmes repeated, as though testing the word itself. "Such an ordinary state, Watson, and yet so profoundly misunderstood. Pembroke stood near the entrance, his gaze shifting anxiously between us and the dark orchid at the center of the room. "You believe it is not the flower?" he asked. Holmes paused beside a long wooden bench upon which several smaller plants rested in careful arrangement. He did not answer at once. Instead, he bent slightly, examining the leaves of one specimen, then another, his attention drifting, not in distraction, but in deliberate pattern. "It is the flower," he said at last. "And yet it is not." Pembroke frowned, clearly unsettled. "I do not understand." Holmes straightened and turned, his expression calm, though his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Consider, Pembroke," he said, "the rarity of your orchid. You described it as blooming only once in many years." "Yes, that is correct." "And yet," Holmes continued, "tonight it has bloomed precisely when your colleague chose to remain in the conservatory after hours." Pembroke hesitated. "He often worked late. It is not unusual." "Indeed," Holmes said gently. "And yet coincidence, when paired with rarity, becomes interesting." I rose now, stepping away from the sleeping man, though I found myself glancing back at him with a physician's unease. "You mentioned the scent," I said, "that it lingers." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Yes." He moved again toward the orchid, though he kept a careful distance, as though respecting an invisible boundary. "Tell me, Miss Pembroke," he said, "when you first entered this room tonight, what did you feel?" Pembroke blinked, taken aback. "Felt?" "Yes. Not what you saw, what you experienced." The man drew a slow breath, as though searching through memory. "It was warm," he said, "warmer than usual, perhaps, and the air seemed heavy." Holmes nodded faintly. "Go on." "There was a scent," Pembroke continued, "very faint. I cannot describe it exactly. Not sweet, not bitter, something else." Holmes's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "And how did it affect you?" Pembroke hesitated again. "I felt calm," he admitted, "strangely so, as though the urgency of the situation has softened." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Fascinating," he murmured. I folded my arms thoughtfully. "Certain compounds can induce drowsiness when inhaled," I said, "though for such an effect to occur so quickly, and without any lingering harm, would be highly unusual." Holmes gave a slight smile. "My dear Watson, the unusual is often merely the misunderstood." He turned once more to the orchid. Its dark petals seemed almost motionless, absorbing the lamplight, offering nothing in return. "You see before you," Holmes said softly, "a perfect disguise." Pembroke shifted uneasily. "Disguise?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "Nature provides the form, but something else provides the function." A faint drip echoed from the glass above, the condensation gathering and falling in slow, measured rhythm. Holmes stepped to one side, his gaze lowering now, not to the flower itself, but to the base of the pot. He crouched slightly, observing. "Curious," he said. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended a finger, not touching, but tracing the air just above the rim of the pot. "There is a residue here," he said at last, "almost imperceptible." Pembroke leaned forward anxiously. "Residue of what?" Holmes rose again, brushing his hands together lightly. "That," he said, "is precisely the question." He began to walk slowly around the center of the conservatory, his attention drifting outward, now, toward the arrangement of the surrounding plants, the spacing of the pathways, the subtle geometry of the room. "To the casual observer," Holmes continued, "this is a place of quiet cultivation, order, care." His gaze moved toward a narrow vent near the upper frame of the glass wall. "But to the attentive," he paused, it is system, I followed his line of sight. A system? I echoed. Holmes turned slightly, his expression thoughtful. Air flows, Watson, he said. Even in stillness, especially in stillness, it moves in patterns, guided by temperature, by structure, by design. Pembroke's face paled slightly. You mean? Holmes's voice softened. I mean, Pembroke, that whatever placed your colleague into this unnatural sleep, he glanced once more at the orchid, did not do so by chance. A silence followed, deep and unbroken. Even the faint dripping seemed to pause, as though listening. I looked again at the sleeping man, his face serene, untouched by distress. Can he be awakened? I asked quietly. Holmes considered this for a moment. Yes, he said at last. I believe he can. Pembroke exhaled with visible relief. But not yet, Holmes added. The relief faltered. Holmes moved toward the exit, his steps calm, deliberate. For now, he said, we must understand the breadth of the orchid before we attempt to break its hold. He paused at the threshold, glancing once more over his shoulder at the dark bloom, standing silent at the heart of the glasshouse. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the panes, and within, the air remained warm, heavy, and faintly, almost imperceptibly, changed. The conservatory door closed behind us with a soft final sound, gentler than one might expect, yet carrying a quiet sense of separation, as though we had stepped not merely outside, but away from something that preferred to remain undisturbed. The night air met us cool and clean. I drew a slow breath, only then realizing how heavy the atmosphere within had truly been. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes paused upon the stone path, his gaze lingering on the glass structure behind us. The faint glow within gave it an almost dreamlike quality, blurred by the ever-thickening fog. You feel the difference, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I replied, quite distinctly. Holmes gave a small nod. Then we may conclude, he murmured, that the environment within that conservatory is curated. Pembroke, who had followed us out, turned anxiously. Curated? You mean altered? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped slowly along the perimeter of the glasshouse, his eyes tracing its length, its height, its subtle angles. Locked from within, you said, Holmes remarked. Yes, Pembroke replied quickly. I am most certain of it. The doors were secured. The windows, well, you may see for yourself. They do not open fully. Holmes approached one of the glass panels, raising his hand to the frame without touching it. The condensation clung thickly to the surface, blurring the interior into shadow and muted shape. And yet, Holmes said softly, a system requires interaction. I followed his gaze. You believe someone entered? I asked. Holmes tilted his head slightly. I believe, he said, that something occurred here which cannot be explained by isolation alone. Pembroke shifted uneasily, but there were no footprints, no disturbances. I examined the floor myself. Holmes turned to him with a faint, almost sympathetic expression. My dear Mr. Pembroke, he said gently, the absence of disturbance is in itself a form of evidence. The fog drifted lazily around us, softening the edges of the garden beyond. Even the distant sounds of London seemed to have receded further still, as though this small corner of the world had slipped into a quieter realm. Holmes moved toward the rear of the conservatory now, where the structure met the outer wall of the property. There, he said. I stepped closer. A narrow section of the glass house appeared slightly different, not in any obvious way, but with a subtle irregularity. The frame was older, perhaps, or simply less maintained. Holmes crouched, his eyes level with the base of the structure. Observe, he said. I followed his indication. At first I saw nothing. Then, faintly, a line. Not a crack, nor break, but a seam so slight it might have been dismissed as a trick of the light. A panel? I suggested. Holmes rose slowly. Possibly, he said. Though if so, it is expertly concealed. Pembroke leaned forward, squinting. I have never noticed such a thing. Holmes smiled faintly. That is precisely why it interests me. He stepped back, his gaze drifting upward now, to the roof of the conservatory, where the glass curved in elegant arcs. Tell me, Holmes said, how is the temperature maintained? Pipes, Pembroke replied. Heating pipes run beneath the floor. There are also vents, small ones, to regulate the air. Holmes nodded. Yes, I noticed. His attention returned briefly to the upper frame, where a narrow vent sat partially obscured by condensation. Air enters, he murmured, and air leaves. I considered this. If there were some substance introduced into the air, I said slowly, it could be dispersed throughout the room. Holmes gave me an approving glance. Just so, Watson. Pembroke's face grew pale once more. You believe the air itself is responsible? Holmes clasped his hands lightly behind his back. I believe, he said, that the air within that conservatory is not entirely what it appears to be. A faint silence followed. Even the fog seemed to pause. But how? Pembroke asked. And by whom? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he began to walk again, this time toward the main entrance, his pace unhurried, his thoughts clearly unfolding in quiet sequence. The door, he said at last. Yes, Pembroke replied. You locked it upon leaving? No, Pembroke said. It was already locked. From the inside. I had to use my key. Holmes stopped. Ah. A single syllable, but one that carried weight. And Mr. Everley possessed a key as well? Yes, of course. Holmes turned slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. Then we are presented with a most delicate arrangement. I stepped closer. In what sense? Holmes's voice softened, almost blending with the night air. A man lies asleep within a sealed environment, no visible means of entry, no visible means of exit. He glanced once more toward the conservatory. And yet, his gaze shifted to the faint seam at the rear panel, to the upper vents, to the quiet geometry of the structure itself. The system breathes. Pembroke swallowed. You mean someone could have introduced, whatever this is, without entering at all? Holmes inclined his head. It is a possibility. The fog curled gently around us, brushing past like a slow-moving tide. I found myself looking again at the glowing silhouette of the conservatory, its interior obscured, its secrets held behind glass and stillness. There is something else, I said quietly. Holmes turned. The absence of disturbance, I continued. You mentioned it earlier. If a man collapsed suddenly, would there not be some sign? A knocked pot, disturbed soil. Holmes's expression shifted, just slightly. Yes, he said. A pause. And yet, there was none. Pembroke's voice trembled. Then what does that mean? Holmes looked at him, not unkindly, but with a calm certainty that seemed almost at odds with the unease of the moment. It means, he said softly, that Mr. Everley did not fall. The words lingered. I felt a faint chill, despite the stillness of the air. He lay down? I asked. Holmes's gaze returned once more to the conservatory. Yes, Watson, he said. His voice dropped to little more than a whisper. I believe he did. A long silence followed. The fog pressed closer. And within the glasshouse, unseen but ever present, the midnight orchid remained in bloom. The fog did not lift with the passing of the hour. Instead, it seemed to settle more deeply into the quiet corners of the garden, as though reluctant to release its hold upon the night. The conservatory stood behind us, silent and dim, its glass panes now little more than blurred reflections of a world beyond. For a time, none of us spoke. Then, at last, Sherlock Holmes turned from the structure and faced Mr. Pembroke with that calm, attentive expression which so often preceded a shift in the case. "There is a question," Holmes said gently, "which you have not yet answered." Pembroke blinked, startled slightly. "I have tried to tell you everything, Mr. Holmes." "Yes," Holmes replied, "everything that appears relevant." A pause. "But not everything that is." Pembroke's fingers tightened faintly around his gloves. Holmes continued, his tone still soft, almost reassuring. "This orchid, so rare, so long awaited, was not acquired without effort." "No," Pembroke admitted. "It took years of negotiation, considerable expense, and interest," Holmes added, "from others." Pembroke hesitated. Holmes watched him carefully. "Come," Holmes said, his voice lowering just enough to suggest quiet understanding rather than accusation. "The past often lingers where the present appears most still." The man exhaled slowly. "There was another collector," he said at last. I shifted slightly, noting the subtle change in his tone, not merely reluctance, but something closer to unease. "Another collector?" I asked. "Yes, a botanist, in fact, far more knowledgeable than I." Holmes inclined his head. "His name, Dr. Silas Rowan." The name seemed to settle into the air with a curious weight. Holmes's expression did not change, though I noticed the faintest narrowing of his eyes. "And this Dr. Rowan," Holmes said, "shared your interest in the orchid?" "More than shared it," Pembroke replied quietly. "He was obsessed." The fog shifted softly around us, brushing the hedges and pathways with a pale, drifting hand. "Obsessed?" Holmes echoed. "Yes," Pembroke said. "He believed the orchid possessed properties beyond mere rarity, that it was unique even among exotic species." Holmes glanced briefly toward the conservatory. "In what sense?" Pembroke swallowed. "He spoke of its scent," he said, "claimed it had unusual effects. I dismissed it, of course. Many botanists become fanciful when dealing with such specimens." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "you remember his words." Pembroke gave a faint, uneasy nod. "He said the orchid did not merely release fragrance," he continued. "He said it altered perception, induced calm, even unconsciousness, felt a quiet stirring of recognition." "Then you believed him?" I asked. "No," Pembroke said quickly. "At least, not then." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And now?" Pembroke did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft hush of the fog. "At the time," he said finally, "we competed for the plant. There were disagreements." Holmes's tone remained gentle. "Disagreements of a professional nature?" Pembroke's eyes flickered. "Not entirely." Holmes said nothing, allowing the truth to emerge in its own time. Pembroke looked down briefly. "Rowan believed I lacked the expertise to care for such a specimen," he admitted. "He accused me of acquiring it merely for prestige." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I told him," Pembroke said, his voice tightening slightly, "that possession is the only expertise that matters." A faint silence followed. Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "And what became of Dr. Rowan?" Pembroke hesitated. "He disappeared," he said. The word lingered. "Disappeared?" I repeated. "Yes, some years ago, without explanation, no forwarding address, no notice." Holmes's gaze drifted once more to the conservatory. "And yet," he said softly, "his ideas remain." Pembroke looked up sharply. "You think he is involved?" Holmes did not answer directly. "Tell me," he said instead. Who else has access to our conservatory? Very few, Pembroke replied. Myself, Mr. Everley, and the caretaker. The caretaker, Holmes repeated. Yes, a quiet fellow. Has worked here for years, tends the plants, maintains the structure. Holmes nodded faintly. And he was present tonight? I believe so, Pembroke said, though I did not see him when I entered. Holmes's eyes shifted slightly, thoughtful, curious. The fog thickened again, curling softly along the ground. Mr. Pembroke, Holmes continued, you mentioned that Dr. Rowan spoke of the orchid's effects as though they were known to him. Yes, and yet such knowledge would require experimentation. Pembroke's expression grew uncertain. I suppose it would. Holmes took a slow step forward, his gaze steady. Then we must consider, he said quietly, whether the orchid itself is the source of these effects, or merely the vessel through which they are delivered. I felt a faint chill at his words. You believe the orchid has been altered? I asked. Holmes gave a slight nod. Or accompanied, he said, a pause, by something unseen. Pembroke looked back toward the conservatory, its glass walls now little more than pale shapes within the fog. And Dr. Rowan? He asked. Holmes's voice softened. A man who understands the language of plants, he said, may also understand how to make them speak in ways others cannot hear. The silence that followed was deep, almost restful, yet beneath it, something had shifted, a presence, an idea, the past, long buried, had stirred. And somewhere, hidden within the quiet order of leaves and glass and air, an old rivalry had begun to breathe once more. The garden seemed quieter still. As we made our way back toward the house, the fog had settled low upon the ground now, drifting in soft layers that brushed against our shoes as we walked. Behind us, the conservatory remained dimly aglow, its glass shell holding its silence with a kind of patient indifference. You caretaker, said Sherlock Holmes at last. You mentioned he has been in your employ for some years. Yes, Pembroke replied, nearly a decade. His name is Elias Finch. Holmes inclined his head slightly. A long time to tend a garden. He is reliable, Pembroke added quickly. Quiet, but diligent. He knows the plants better than I do. Holmes gave a faint, thoughtful smile. That is often the case. We reached the back entrance of the house, and Pembroke led us inside. The transition from the cool dampness of the night to the warm, still air within felt almost unnatural, as though one stepped from a dream into another. The hallway was dimly lit, the lamps turned low. The house itself seemed to rest, its silence deep and undisturbed. This way, Pembroke said quietly. We followed him through a narrow corridor that led toward a smaller wing of the house, less ornate, more practical. The scent here was different. No longer the rich, damp fragrance of soil and leaves, but something simpler, clean, faintly metallic. The caretaker resides here, Pembroke explained. He keeps to himself. Holmes's gaze drifted slowly across the walls, the floor, the small details most would overlook. And tonight? Holmes asked. Have you seen him? Pembroke shook his head. No, not since earlier this evening. Holmes stopped. Earlier, he repeated. Yes, Pembroke said. Just before dusk, he was making his usual rounds in the conservatory. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. His usual rounds, Holmes said softly. At what hour do these occur? Every evening, Pembroke replied. He checks the temperature, waters certain plants, ensures the vents are properly adjusted. Holmes nodded. A routine, then. Yes. Holmes resumed walking, though his pace had slowed slightly. A man's routine, he said, is often the most revealing aspect of his character. We reached a simple wooden door at the end of the corridor. Pembroke hesitated only briefly before knocking. No response. He knocked again, slightly louder this time. Still nothing. Holmes stepped forward. "May I?" he asked. Pembroke nodded, stepping aside. Holmes tried the handle. The door opened. Inside, the room was modest, neatly arranged, almost to a fault. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its covers undisturbed. A small table held a lantern, a few tools, and a carefully folded cloth. There was no sign of its occupant. Holmes entered slowly, his eyes moving with quiet precision from one detail to the next. "Order," he murmured. I stepped in behind him. "Everything appears normal," I said. Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he approached the table, examining the items placed upon it. "A lantern," he said, unlit. His gaze shifted. "Tools, cleaned and arranged." He paused. "Too arranged." Pembroke stood at the doorway, his unease returning. "What do you mean?" Holmes lifted one of the tools, a small pruning instrument, and held it lightly between his fingers. "For a man engaged in daily labor," Holmes said, "there is usually some evidence of that labor lingering, a trace of soil, a smudge, a slight disorder." He set the tool back exactly where he had found it. "But here," he continued, "we find perfection." I glanced around the room again. "You believe it has been prepared?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint nod. "Either prepared," he said, "or abandoned with intention." Pembroke's voice tightened. "You think he has fled?" Holmes turned slightly. "I think," he said, "that Mr. Finch has chosen not to be present." The distinction hung quietly in the air. Holmes moved toward the bed now, his gaze lowering. "The covers are untouched," he observed. "He has not slept here tonight." Pembroke's unease deepened. "But he must be somewhere," he said. Holmes straightened. "Yes," he replied softly, "somewhere." His eyes drifted briefly toward the window at the far end of the room. It was closed, though not entirely sealed. 14. A faint line of cooler air slipped through its edge, stirring the curtain just slightly. Holmes approached it, pausing to examine the latch. "No signs of forced entry," he said. "No disturbance." I folded my arms thoughtfully. "If he left," I said, "he did so calmly." "Precisely," Holmes replied. A silence followed. Then, almost as an afterthought, Holmes bent slightly, his gaze shifting downward to the floor beside the bed. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt. "There," he said quietly. I stepped closer. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just visible against the wood, a faint mark, not a footprint, not quite, a subtle trace, a thin curved line, as though something small had been dragged lightly across the surface. Holmes traced its shape in the air, not touching. "Curious," he murmured. Pembroke leaned in, his brow furrowing. "I have never seen that before." Holmes rose slowly. "No," he said. His voice was calm. "But I believe," he added, "that it has been here long enough." He turned toward the door. "Mr. Finch is a man of routine," Holmes continued. "He tends the plants, adjusts the air, maintains the system." His gaze shifted, thoughtful once more. "And tonight," a pause, "the system behaved exactly as required." Pembroke swallowed. "You believe he is involved?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he moved past us into the corridor once more. "The question, Mr. Pembroke," he said softly, "is not whether Mr. Finch is involved." He paused briefly, his eyes lifting as though following an unseen thread, "but whether he acts alone." The house remained quiet, too quiet, and somewhere beyond its walls, within the warm stillness of glass and shadow, the conservatory waited. The house had grown quieter still. Even the faint creaks of settling wood seemed to have withdrawn, leaving behind a hush so complete that one became aware of the smallest movements, the soft shift of fabric, the distant ticking of a clock, the gentle rhythm of breath. We had returned once more to the warmth of 221B Baker Street, only in memory, for in truth we remained within Pembroke's residence, though the feeling was much the same, a place of stillness where thought could unfold. Sherlock Holmes stood near a narrow writing desk in a quiet sitting room, its lamp casting a soft amber circle of light. Upon the surface lay a few scattered botanical notes Pembroke had retrieved, sketches of leaves, annotations in careful handwriting, and among them a detailed illustration of the orchid itself. Holmes regarded the drawing in silence. I sat nearby, my hands folded, my thoughts returning again and again to the sleeping man within the conservatory. "It is unlike any natural sleep I have observed," I said at last. "There is no distress, no fever, no irregularity, and yet he cannot be roused." Holmes nodded faintly. "Yes," he said. "It is not sleep as we understand it." Pembroke stood near the doorway. His unease softened now into something quieter, anxious patience. "You spoke earlier," he said, "of the orchid as a kind of vessel." Holmes's gaze did not leave the illustration. "Indeed, and of something accompanying it," Pembroke continued, "something unseen." Holmes reached out and turned the page slowly, revealing a second sketch, this one more detailed, showing not only the bloom, but the structure of its stem and roots. "Miss Pembroke," Holmes said, "you are familiar, I assume, with the more subtle properties of plant life." Pembroke hesitated. "To a degree. I am no scientist, but I understand their general behaviors." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you then you will know that plants communicate, not in sound, but in chemistry. They release compounds into the air, signaling distress, attracting pollinators, influencing their environment." "Yes," Pembroke said, "that is well established." Holmes' finger traced lightly along the edge of the drawn petals. "But what if," he said softly, "such communication were refined?" I leaned forward slightly. "Refined?" I echoed. Holmes turned now, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Consider, Watson," he said, "that certain compounds affect the human nervous system. Some stimulate, others soothe, a few incapacitate. You suggest the orchid produces such a compound?" I asked. Holmes shook his head faintly. "Not naturally," he said. A pause. "But with guidance, perhaps." Pembroke's expression tightened. "You mean altered," he said. Holmes gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I mean instructed." The word hung in the air, peculiar yet precise. I frowned slightly. "Plants cannot be instructed, Holmes." Holmes clasped his hands lightly behind his back. "No," he said, "but they can be cultivated, selectively, deliberately, until their natural tendencies are shaped into something more specific." He moved slowly across the room, his steps measured. "A scent," he continued, "barely perceptible. A room enclosed, air guided through vents, warmed, circulated." His gaze lifted slightly, as though tracing invisible currents, and within that air, a compound, not strong enough to alarm, not sharp enough to detect, yet sufficient, over time, to quiet the mind. Pembroke swallowed. "Quiet. Into sleep?" Holmes nodded. "Yes." The silence deepened. I considered this carefully. "But even so," I said, "for a man to simply lie down, without resistance, without awareness, it suggests something more than passive exposure." Holmes's eyes brightened slightly. "Excellent, Watson." He turned toward me. "You perceive the essential point." I leaned forward. Then it is not merely the air, I said. There must be a moment, a threshold, at which the effect becomes decisive. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. Pembroke looked between us, his unease returning. Then the orchid is only part of it, he said. Holmes's gaze softened. Yes, he replied, part of a language. A language? Pembroke repeated. Holmes gestured lightly toward the sketches. A system of signals, he said. Scent, temperature, environment, all working together, each element, subtle, almost meaningless on its own. He paused, but combined. His voice lowered slightly. They become persuasive. The words seem to settle into the quiet, like a soft echo. I felt a faint chill despite the warmth of the room. You mean the man was not forced into sleep, I said slowly. Holmes met my gaze. I believe, he said, that he was guided there. Pembroke's voice trembled slightly. Guided? By what? Holmes turned once more toward the illustration of the orchid. By something that understands both plant and mind, he said softly. A long silence followed. The lamplight flickered gently, casting shifting shadows along the walls. I glanced toward the window, where the fog pressed faintly against the glass, its presence constant and patient. And Dr. Rowan? I asked. Holmes did not turn. A man who listens to plants, he said, may also learn to speak through them. Pembroke exhaled slowly. You believe he has returned? Holmes's expression remained calm. I believe, he said, that his ideas have a pause, and ideas, Holmes added quietly, are far more difficult to confine than men. The room fell silent once more. Yet beneath that silence, something had begun to take shape, not yet clear, not yet complete, but present, a pattern, a system, a language spoken not in words, but in breath and stillness. And somewhere within it, a mind, patient and precise, waiting to be understood. The hour had grown late, so late that it no longer felt like night, but rather that quiet, suspended interval where even time itself seems reluctant to move forward. Within Pembroke's house, the lamps burned low, the air was still, and yet, beneath that stillness, there lingered a faint tension, as though something unseen had begun to shift. Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, his gaze fixed outward into the fog. His posture remained relaxed, but there was a quiet alertness in him now, a readiness that had not been present before. I sat nearby watching him. You are waiting, I said. Holmes did not turn. Yes. For what? Holmes's voice was soft. For the system to repeat itself. The words had scarcely settled when a sound. Footsteps, hurried, uneven, approaching along the corridor. Pembroke appeared in the doorway, his composure gone. Mr. Holmes. He stopped, catching his breath. It has happened again. Holmes turned. Where? In the conservatory, Pembroke said. The caretaker, Finch. He has been found there. A pause. Asleep. The words seemed to echo faintly in the quiet room. Holmes did not hesitate. Come, he said. We moved quickly this time, though Holmes's pace remained controlled, his movements precise rather than rushed. The corridor gave way to the rear entrance, and once more we stepped out into the cool embrace of the night. The fog had thickened further. The conservatory's glow was dimmer now, muted, almost distant. As we approached, I became aware of something subtle, a change. Do you feel that? I asked quietly. Holmes nodded once. Yes. Pembroke fumbled slightly with the key, his hands unsteady. What is it? He asked. It feels heavier than before. Holmes said nothing. The door opened. Warmth greeted us again, though it was different now, not oppressive, but deeper, more settled. The faint scent lingered, just at the edge of perception, and at the center, the orchid. It had changed. Its dark petals seemed more open now, fuller, as though the bloom had deepened since we had last seen it. The velvet darkness of it drew the eye, holding it in a quiet, almost gentle insistence. "A second bloom," Pembroke whispered. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon it. "Yes," he said softly. Beside the orchard, another figure lay upon the ground. Elias Finch, of Dr. John Watson, stepped forward at once. Again, I knelt, my hands moving instinctively to examine him. His condition was identical. Breathing slow, pulse steady, no sign of distress. "He is as the other," I said quietly. "No injury, no struggle." Holmes approached more closely this time, though his movements remained deliberate. "Observe his position," Holmes said. I glanced down. Finch lay upon his side, one hand resting loosely near the base of the orchid's pot, as though he had reached toward it and simply stopped. "He came willingly," I murmured. Holmes inclined his head. "Yes." Pembroke's voice trembled. "But why would he do such a thing?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the base of the orchid, his attention returning once more to the pot, the soil, the faint unseen details that lay beyond ordinary notice. Then, slowly, he shifted his gaze upward to the vents, the narrow openings near the curved glass above. "They are open wider now," he said. Pembroke looked up sharply. I did not adjust them." Holmes rose. "No," he said, "but someone did." A faint silence followed. I stood, my thoughts turning quickly. "If the air carries the compound," I said, "then increasing the flow would increase its effect." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." Pembroke's unease deepened. "But the caretaker, Finch, he was the one who tended the vents. Why would he—" Holmes turned to him gently. "Because," he said, "he understood the system." The words lingered. I looked again at Finch, lying in that unnatural calm. "Then he was not a victim?" I asked. Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Oh, he is a victim," Holmes said quietly. "But not in the way we first imagined." The fog pressed faintly against the glass, blurring the outside world into pale abstraction. "And the orchid?" Pembroke asked. "Why has it changed?" Holmes's gaze returned to the bloom. "Because," he said, "it has completed its function once." A pause. "And now," he added softly, "it repeats." I felt a subtle shift in the air, something deeper than scent, something that seemed to touch not the senses, but the mind itself. A quiet pull. Holmes stepped back immediately. "Do not linger too near," he said calmly. I straightened, moving slightly away. Pembroke followed, his unease now unmistakable. "What does it mean?" he asked. Holmes's voice remained steady. "It means," he said, "that the system is active." He glanced once more at the two sleeping figures, then at the orchid, then at the vents above. "All elements are in place," he continued. A faint pause, "which leaves only one question." Pembroke swallowed. "And that is?" Holmes turned slightly, his eyes calm, clear, and quietly certain. "Who," he said, "set it in motion tonight?" The conservatory remained silent. The orchid stood in full bloom, and around it, unseen, yet ever present, the air continued to breathe. The conservatory seemed to listen, not in any literal sense, and yet there was a peculiar awareness to the space now, as though each movement, each breath, each thought carried a quiet consequence within its glass confines. The two men lay undisturbed. The orchid stood at their center, its dark petals open in a silent, patient display, and the air, warm, faintly scented, continued its subtle work. "Watson," said Sherlock Holmes calmly, "we must alter the conditions." I understood him at once. Moving quickly but without panic, I crossed toward the nearest vent along the wall. The mechanism was simple, a narrow metal lever, slightly damp from condensation. I adjusted it, reducing the opening. The effect was not immediate, but it was perceptible. The air shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Holmes, meanwhile, had moved to the opposite side of the conservatory, repeating the action with careful precision. One by one, he altered the vents, narrowing the pathways through which the air flowed. The faint heaviness began, gradually, to lift. Pembroke stood near the door, watching us with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Will it wake them?" he asked quietly. Holmes did not look up. "In time," he said. He straightened, his gaze returning once more to the orchid. "But first," he added, "we must understand how the system sustains itself." I joined him near the center. "You believe there is something more than the vents," I said. Holmes inclined his head. Yes." He crouched again beside the orchid, his attention fixed not upon the bloom itself, but upon the base of its pot. "Earlier," he said, "I observed a residue. Now," he paused, "it is clearer." I leaned slightly closer, though mindful of the air. "What do you see?" Holmes did not touch the pot. Instead, he traced its outline with his gaze, following the curve of the ceramic, the line where it met the soil. "Not soil alone," he murmured. Pembroke stepped nearer, though he kept his distance. "What do you mean?" Holmes rose slowly. "This plant," he said, "is not simply growing here." A pause. "It is anchored." The word lingered. "Anchored?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "Yes." "Fixed in place, not merely by its roots, but by design." He stepped back slightly, his eyes now moving across the immediate surroundings, the tiled floor, the base of the central platform, the subtle symmetry of the layout. "Observe the arrangement," he said. "The orchid is positioned precisely at the center of the conservatory." "That is by intention," Pembroke said. "It is the most important specimen." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and therefore the most influential." He glanced upward once more toward the vents. "Air enters from above, circulates, and settles here." His gaze returned to the floor. "And from here," he paused, "it rises again." I frowned slightly. "Rises?" Holmes looked at me. "Yes, Watson." A faint silence followed. Then, with deliberate calm, Holmes stepped closer to the base of the orchid once more, and this time he knelt. His hand moved, not to the plant, but to the edge of the tiled surface upon which it stood. "There," he said quietly. I followed his indication. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, a line, even fainter than the seam we had observed outside, a circular line. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A platform," he murmured. Pembroke leaned forward. "A platform, but it has always been there." Holmes nodded slightly. "Yes," he said, "but not always as it is now." He looked up at Pembroke. "Tell me, has this central section ever been altered?" Pembroke hesitated. I had some renovations done last year," he said slowly. "Heating adjustments, reinforcement of the floor." Holmes's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Just so." He rose to his feet. "This is no mere base," he said. "It is a mechanism." The words settled into the warm air with quiet weight. "A mechanism," I repeated. Holmes stepped back, his gaze encompassing the entire space. The orchid, the vents, the surrounding plants, a concealed structure beneath the floor, he said, designed to release, circulate, and perhaps even regulate the compound we have observed. Pembroke's voice trembled. "You mean the entire conservatory has been altered?" Holmes inclined his head. Yes, a pause, and very carefully I looked again at the orchid, its petals unmoving, its presence almost serene. But who could have constructed such a thing? I asked. Holmes's eyes drifted briefly toward the sleeping figure of Elias Finch. A man who understands the environment, he said quietly, who tends it daily, who adjusts its balance without drawing notice. Pembroke's face paled. The caretaker? Holmes did not contradict him. He had access, Holmes continued, knowledge, routine. A faint silence followed. And yet, I said, if he constructed this system, why would he succumb to it himself? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Because, he said, the system was not intended to harm him. A pause. But something has changed. The air felt lighter now, though the faint scent still lingered at its edges. Holmes stepped once more toward the orchard. This device, he said, was designed to operate within precise limits, a careful balance of exposure. He glanced upward. The vents widened, beyond their usual setting. Pembroke swallowed. You mean the system was pushed far? Holmes nodded. Yes. I looked again at Finch, lying still beside the plant he had tended. Then he became its victim, I said quietly. Holmes's voice softened, or its final witness. The words lingered. A deep, quiet stillness settled over the conservatory once more. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the glass. Inside, the mechanism, now partially stilled, seemed to rest. But beneath the surface, hidden and precise, its purpose had already been fulfilled. Holmes turned slightly, his expression calm, resolved. We are very close now, Watson, he said. A pause. Very close indeed. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came gently, almost reluctantly, like a soft breath drawn across the sleeping city. The fog thinned not by lifting, but by fading, its edges dissolving into pale light, until the world beyond the glass began, slowly, to return. Within the conservatory, the air had changed. The warmth remained, but the heaviness, the subtle persuasion that had lingered through the night, had all but vanished. The vents, now properly adjusted, allowed a quieter, more natural rhythm to take hold, and at the center, the orchid stood in stillness. Its dark petals, once so full and open, had begun to soften inward, not withering, but retreating, its brief moment of presence passing as quietly as it had come. Beside it, the two men stirred. I knelt first beside Mr. Everley, my hand once again finding his pulse. It was stronger now, more responsive. His breathing deepened, then shifted. A moment later, his eyelids fluttered. He woke not with alarm, but with confusion, like a man rising from an unusually deep dream. Easy, I said softly. You are quite safe. Across the platform, Elias Finch followed much the same path. A slight movement of his hand, a slow intake of breath, and then awareness, returning in fragments. Neither man spoke at first. They simply sat, blinking gently in the softened morning light, as though uncertain whether the night had ended or merely changed. Behind us, Sherlock Holmes stood quietly, observing. There is no lasting harm, I said, rising to my feet. No sign of damage, only an induced state of unconsciousness. Holmes inclined his head, as expected. Pembroke exhaled, the tension of the night finally leaving him. Thank heavens, he murmured. His gaze shifted toward the orchid. And this? He asked. Holmes stepped forward slowly. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply regarded the bloom, its dark surface now less consuming, its presence gentler, quieter. A remarkable creation, Holmes said at last. Creation? Pembroke repeated. Holmes glanced toward the base of the platform. Yes, he said, not merely a plant, but an instrument, a pause, an instrument designed to demonstrate a principle. I stepped closer. The language of plants, I said. Holmes gave a faint smile. Just so, Watson. He turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the rear panel of the conservatory, the one whose hidden seam we had uncovered. The mechanism beneath the floor, the adjustment of air, the refinement of scent, Holmes continued, all working in concert. Pembroke's expression tightened. But to what end? Holmes's voice softened. Not destruction, he said. Not even harm. A pause. But proof. The word lingered. Proof? Pembroke echoed. Holmes nodded. That such a system could exist, he said. The mind may be guided, quietly, gently, without force. I considered this. And Dr. Rowan? I asked. Holmes's gaze remained steady. A man who believed his ideas were overlooked, he said. Dismissed. He glanced once more toward the orchid. And so he chose to demonstrate them, without spectacle, without announcement. Pembroke's voice was low. By placing my colleague and my caretaker into this sleep, Holmes met his gaze. Yes, a silence followed. But why here? Pembroke asked. Why my conservatory? Holmes' expression softened, almost kindly. Because, he said, you possessed the one element he required, the orchid. Holmes inclined his head. And the environment in which to complete his design. Pembroke looked once more at the bloom, its petals now slowly closing. And now? He asked. Holmes stepped back. Now, he said, the demonstration is complete. The air felt lighter still, clear, at ease. And Dr. Rowan? I asked quietly. Holmes turned toward the glass wall, where the last traces of fog drifted faintly beyond. He has already departed, he said. You are certain? Holmes gave a small, thoughtful smile. A man who communicates through absence, he said, rarely lingers once he has been understood. The words settled gently into the morning. Behind us, the two men, once lost to that unnatural sleep, now sat quietly, their awareness returning in full. They spoke in low tones, their voices calm, as though the night had left no lasting mark beyond a faint and distant memory. Holmes reached for his coat. Come, Watson, he said. I followed him toward the door, pausing only once to glance back. The orchid stood alone now, its dark bloom no longer commanding, no longer persuasive, simply present. As we stepped out into the morning light, the city greeted us once more, not with noise, but with quiet awakening. The fog had thinned to a gentle veil. The streets, still damp, reflected the pale glow of day. Beside me, Holmes walked in silence. Tell me, I said after a time, do you consider this case concluded? Holmes's eyes remained forward. Concluded, he repeated softly. A faint pause. Yes, he said. Because the mechanism has been found? Holmes shook his head slightly. No, Watson. He glanced briefly upward, as though listening to something far beyond the sounds of the waking city. Because the question has been answered. I waited. Holmes's voice, when he spoke again, was quiet, almost reflective. There are many ways to influence a man, he said. Force is the cruelest among them. A pause. But the gentlest, he allowed the thought to linger, are often the most effective. We walked on, and behind us, in a quiet glass house, now touched by morning, the midnight orchid closed its petals and returned once more to silence.